Good morning. Today's lecture is entitled Down the Road to Disunion, so it's another in the lectures that deal with the coming of the Civil War. The problem of slavery had begun to tear the American political parties apart. The Whig Party was the first to crumble. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 destroyed its cross-sectional appeal. The Democrats would hold things together for a little while longer until the election of 1860, when they too would divide along sectional lines, although their division was not fatal. The Democratic Party of the 1850s is the Democratic Party of today, although obviously ideology has changed. The beneficiary of the demise of the Whig Party and the defection of a few Northern Democrats was one of the several new parties, the Republicans. At a rally in a small church in Wisconsin, those attending decided to advance the cause of anti-slavery, and they adopted the name Republicans. So the Republican Party comes into existence, and this is the Republican Party of today, as the party of anti-slavery. In Michigan, another branch of the same party formed and proclaimed, and I quote, "In view of the necessity of battling for the first principles of Republican government and against the schemes of aristocracy, Southern plantation owners, the most oppressive of which the earth was ever cursed or man debased, we will cooperate and be known as Republicans." Other states followed suit in organizing their own Republican Party. And several of the new parties, chief among them the Free Soil Party, decided to add their strength to the Republicans. Free Soilers, and this is an important distinction, were opposed to the expansion of slavery on economic grounds, not on moral grounds. They believed that slavery made white labor impractical and thus retarded the growth of the capitalist system. For Free Soilers, slavery and capitalism could not coexist. The new party held its first national convention in 1856, and they nominated John Charles Fremont for the presidency. The same Fremont who had explored the West and helped Californians take California from the Mexicans. Indeed, it was Fremont's status as a war hero that made him so attractive to the Republicans. The Republican campaign slogan captured the ideals of the Republican Party in 1856. The slogan was "Free Soil, Free Speech, and Fremont." Free soil, obviously, a reference to the free soil ideology. Free speech, a reference to the idea that those who were opposed to slavery faced efforts in Congress to gag their free speech on the subject. Southerners didn't want people to talk about the anti-slavery position in Congress. In regard to the ideology of the Republican Party, historian Eric Foner, and Foner is one of our great authorities on this era, especially on Reconstruction. He said, "Northern opposition to slavery was not merely an attack on Southern slavery. It was an affirmation of the superiority of the social system of the North, a dynamic, expanding, capitalist society whose achievements and destiny were almost wholly the result of the opportunities it offered the average laboring man." Moreover, it was an ideology, republicanism, which blended sectional interest with morality so perfectly that it became the most potent political force in the nation. The binding tie of the Republican Party, the thing that kept the various elements of the Republican Party together, was opposing the expansion of slavery into the territories, not abolition. Abolition is the immediate ending of slavery. That is not the position of the Republican Party. Now, some Republicans are abolitionists, but the thing that tied the Republican Party's elements together was the opposition to the expansion of slavery into the territories. In other words, Republicans were going to solve, that is, end the slavery issue gradually over time. More about that in a few minutes. The Republican Party also called for the admission to the Union of Kansas as a free state. It also advocated federal government financing of railroads and other internal improvements. In other words, the Republicans are going to be the party of the use of the federal government to advance the living standards and the development of the United States. So again, the Republicans here are the party of an activist federal government in the tradition of the Whigs and in the tradition of the Federalists. It is the Democrats who are the party of the South. They are the party of states' rights. They are the party of a weak federal government, of a federal government that does little but protect the national interest. This, of course, is in the tradition of Thomas Jefferson and later Andrew Jackson. The Democrats nominated now James Buchanan of Pennsylvania. He's a Northerner, clearly, but he has Southern ties, Southern sympathies. The Democratic platform advocated the righteousness of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Again, Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. It also supported federal non-intervention in the territories in regard to slavery. So the Democrats are saying slavery can move out into the territories, it's fine with them. Republicans opposed to the expansion of slavery into the territories. The two parties could not have been more opposite in regard to the expansion of slavery. Republicans are going to keep it in the slave states. In the election of 1856, the Democrats had the only truly national candidate. Consequently, Buchanan swept to victory in the South, and he took 5 northern border states, including his home state of Pennsylvania. Nevertheless, for Democrats, for Southerners, Fremont's showing was astonishing. He won every state of the upper North. Southerners now rightly feared what the Republicans might do in 4 years in 1860, given that time to develop and then have campaign and so forth. But for now, the South had their man. Although he was a Northerner, Buchanan was very sympathetic to Southerners. Buchanan had built his long political career on a warm relationship with the South. He believed that saving the Union, which was one of his goals, demanded political concessions to Southerners. And now we come to one of the most important Supreme Court cases in American history, Dred Scott. On March 6, 1857, just as the new Buchanan administration was establishing itself, the Supreme Court finally rendered its decision in the Dred Scott case. Dred Scott was born a slave and belonged to an army surgeon who lived in Missouri. Again, Missouri is a slave state. But now the doctor took Dred Scott and moved to Illinois, which is a free state. And then he later moved to Wisconsin Territory, a free territory. A free territory under the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Now later the doctor returned to Missouri, so back to a slave state, and then he died. At the urging of some white friends who learned about Dred Scott's sojourn in the North, he sued for his freedom on the grounds that his presence in a free territory had made him a free man. Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, a Virginian Southerner, ruled in a 7-2 decision, so it's not close, that Scott lacked standing to sue. Why? Because Dred Scott was a slave, he was not a citizen. And according to Taney, only a citizen can sue. Taney, again, a Southerner from Virginia, added, and I quote now, blacks had for more than a century been regarded as so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. So as far as Taney was concerned, and as far as most Southerners were concerned, blacks, slaves, had no rights whatsoever. Now, Taney may well have left the issue right there. Scott was still a slave. It was irrelevant to Scott by this time because he too had passed away. But it's the issues in the case that are important, at least in terms of the court. And so the court continued to consider the case, even though Scott and the doctor had died. But Taney goes beyond this decision in regard to the case. He ruled on the merits of the case. And in so doing, Taney now casts a fiery log onto the smoldering sectional crisis. Taney's argument now suggests that the Missouri Compromise of 1820 had been unconstitutional all along because it had banned the exportation of slavery into the territories, especially the north, well, not especially, but it had banned the exportation of slavery into the northern territories, those territories above Missouri's southern border. That southern border extended into the Louisiana Purchase. And so what Taney is saying is that Congress had no authority to restrict slavery in the territories. Taney has an eye on the Republican Party and its platform. Taney's decision had no impact on the Missouri Compromise since it had been repealed as a result of the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, when Kansas and Nebraska became open to the possibility of becoming slave states. But it does bring into question the notion of popular sovereignty, the people choose. For if Congress could not exclude slavery from the territories, how could a territorial government, a creation of Congress, a territorial government, exclude slavery from its territory? What Taney is saying is that only a state government can exclude slavery. So what Michigan had done is fine with Taney. Michigan is a state, it can exclude or end slavery if it wants to, but the territories can't do that until they become states. By that time, it might be too late. Slavery might have ensconced itself in that particular territory. And that's exactly what Taney is hoping for, the extension of slavery into the territories. So just as a reminder then, according to Taney, only a state government, having achieved the sovereignty of a state, could outlaw slavery. Obviously, slavery would have much more time to establish itself in a territory under Taney's ruling. Now the North, especially the Republicans, and not all Northerners are Republicans, the North was outraged over this Dred Scott decision. In effect, the court had just declared the Republican Party's platform, no extension of slavery into the territories, unconstitutional. And again, Taney knew exactly what he was doing. The Lincoln-Douglas debates. Their differences over Dred Scott set up the two men, Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas, both from Illinois, as the logical opponents for the United States Senate seat that was up for election in 1858. So first off, the Lincoln-Douglas debates are not during 1860. They're not about the presidency, not directly. That presidential election is still 2 years in the future. This is the election to be elected senator, one of the senators from the state of Illinois. Lincoln now a relatively unknown man, had served one term in Congress, desired to confront Douglas directly, and thus he proposes debates to the more famous man, Stephen Douglas. Douglas agrees to 7 debates in various Illinois cities. So if you were to look at the map of these debates, you would see that these debates are spread out all over Illinois from south to north. These debates are deservedly the most famous political campaign debates in American history. They matched 2 powerful thinkers, hard-hitting speakers, although very different in style. One of them nationally eminent, not Lincoln, Douglas. The other little known outside of his prairie region. To the 7 towns came thousands of people from all walks of life, including newspaper reporters from the major daily newspapers back east and in many parts of the country, in fact. And these people would either sit or stand outdoors in sunshine, in rain, and in the heat and the cold, the dust or the mud, depending upon the climate. The crowds participated in the debates, typical Americans as they were, by shouting out questions to the debaters, interrupting them on occasion, groaning or laughing, as the case may be, or clapping and cheering. And so the crowds were part of the debates. The stakes were higher than the Senate election, as significant as that was. The stakes are higher, even higher than the presidency, for that matter. For the theme of the debates was nothing less than the future of slavery in the United States. Other topics prominent in the day: tariffs, banks, roads, railroads, corruption in government, and other staples of American politics received, and please hear me here, no mention whatsoever in these 7 debates. The sole topic of these debates, the Lincoln-Douglas debates, was slavery in the United States. Lincoln's main thrust was that Douglas had departed from the position of the Founding Fathers. To this day, if one wants to advance one's argument, it is still effective to invoke the Founding Fathers, much more so in Lincoln's day. And Lincoln then argued that while Douglas had departed from the position of the Founding Fathers regarding slavery, the Republicans were upholding that position. Like the founders, Republicans, and I quote now, insist that slavery should be treated as a wrong. And one of the methods of treating it as a wrong is to insist that it grow no larger. In other words, that it not be allowed to move out to the territories. Lincoln added the country could not exist forever half slave and half free. It had existed in that condition so far only because until 1854, most Americans shared the founders' faith that restricting slavery's growth would put it on the path to ultimate extinction. So the founders believed, when they agreed to the Constitution, that slavery was already on the path to gradual and ultimate extinction. Lincoln charged that Douglas not only looks to no end of the institution of slavery, he looks to its perpetuity and nationalization. So it'll go on forever, and the entire nation will become a slave nation. Lincoln said he, Douglas, is thus eradicating the light of reason and the love of liberty in the American people. Well, Douglas was not going to sit for that. Douglas's counterattack smote Lincoln's house-divided metaphor. Why cannot the country continue to exist half slave and half free? divided into free and slave states. Whatever their personal sentiments toward slavery, Douglas said, the fathers, and again I'm quoting, left each state perfectly free to decide the slavery issue for themselves. Douglas continued, if the nation cannot endure half slave and half free, then my opponent, Mr. Lincoln, must set out to make it all free. Such an effort, Douglas argued, will inevitably bring about the dissolution of the Union. That is, the Southerners won't stand for that. Secession will come. Elect Lincoln, elect people like Lincoln, and the Union will come to an end. No, said Douglas, I would not endanger the perpetuity of this Union. I would not blot out the great inalienable rights of white men. See, for Douglas and for many Americans, the Union's purpose was to advance the freedom and equality of white men. And to follow Abraham Lincoln and the Republican Party would bring about the destruction of that Union, and it would end the guarantees of freedom and equality that the Constitution provided white men. You would throw the whole thing into the trash can, not knowing for sure what would replace it. Monarchy? A dictatorship? And so Douglas fears that if Lincoln's view becomes the national view, democracy will end. This was a legitimate fear, and frankly, Abraham Lincoln will share this fear once he becomes president of the United States. It will be one of the reasons he does not let the Southerners secede peacefully. So take Douglas seriously there. Douglas attacked Lincoln's interpretation of Jefferson's phrase in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal. He called Lincoln's view of that phrase a monstrous heresy. Lincoln argued, and will continue to argue throughout the presidency, that Jefferson's phrase, all men are created equal, applies to blacks. All men. Constitution doesn't say all white men. It just says all men. Douglas went on. The signers of the Declaration had no reference to the Negro when they spoke of the equality of all men. Did Thomas Jefferson intend to say that his Negro slaves were created his equal by divine law, and that he was violating that law every day of his life by holding them as slaves? You can hear the ridicule in Douglas's voice. Indeed, Douglas hits his stride on the race issue. He considers it a sure winner in southern and central Illinois. Very important point here now. Yes, Illinois is a northern state. Slavery is illegal, but Illinois is symbolic of the Union as a whole. Northerners, the people who live in northern Illinois, are much more opposed to slavery than the people who live in southern Illinois, right on the border with the South. And the people in the middle and central Illinois, more divided. Douglas proclaims that the Negro must always occupy an inferior position. So he is appealing to the racism even of the people of the northern state of Illinois. And I would argue that the vast majority of the people of the United States had some element of racism, so many more than others, but nevertheless, it's there. It's there. And one can be a racist and be opposed to slavery. There's a conundrum, a mystery. Absolutely true. Many Americans, especially in the North, are opposed to slavery, but they do not think that the Negro is their social and political equal. And you can count, at this point, Abraham Lincoln among them. And so Douglas asked the crowd, are you in favor of conferring upon the Negro the rights of citizenship? No, 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 they responded. If you desire to allow them to come into, them being blacks, if you desire to allow them to come into the state and settle with the white men, if you desire them to vote, then support Mr. Lincoln and the Black Republican Party. And that's how people refer to the Republican Party, the Black Republican Party. It's not a compliment. And so the crowd responds, never, never, never. Now, Douglas overstated Lincoln's position, but he does not overstate the position of the abolitionists in the North. Not at all. Lincoln, as I've just made reference to, at this time was a moderate. Now, his views will gradually change as the war goes on, but we have to get the history right, no matter how squeamish it may make us feel. Lincoln is not a 21st century American. He is a moderate on the slavery issue. He is dead set opposed to slavery, but he does not believe in equal rights for all freed slaves. And he was trying to win an election in a state that was divided on the slavery issue. And most of those Americans, most of those Illinoisans who were opposed to slavery were not for Negro, that's the word they used, were not for black equality. Douglas's mischaracterizing of Lincoln's position exasperated the candidate. He wrote to a friend, one of Lincoln's letters now, Negro equality, it's a quote from Lincoln now to back up the point I was just making, Negro equality? Fudge. That's about as harsh a swear word as Abraham Lincoln ever uttered. How long shall there continue knaves to vend? Knaves are people who are unscrupulous. And fools to gulp, fools to believe, so low a piece of demagogism. A demagogue is somebody who says something he knows is not true. Lincoln admitted that he believed, quote, black people entitled to all the natural rights enumerated in the Declaration of Independence, the right to life, the right to liberty, freedom, no slavery, and the right to pursue happiness. That also would suggest no slavery. But he goes on. I do not understand that because I do not want a Negro woman for a slave, I must necessarily have her for a wife. So he's saying no to social equality. Then he said clearly, I'm not in favor of bringing about the social and political equality of the white and black races. So Lincoln in 1858 is not arguing for civil rights for blacks beyond the rights granted in the Declaration of Independence. And Lincoln says, in addition, I will say, in addition to this, that I believe there is a physical difference between the races that will forbid the two races from ever living together on the basis of social and political equality. At this time, Lincoln is toying with the idea, and even advocating it at various times, that once freed, American freemen now, the former slaves, could be returned to their homelands in Africa. Yes. Now, he is not going to stay there. The ordeal of the Civil War is going to bring him much closer to the idea of social and political equality for blacks, for the freed slaves. Well, so far would Lincoln go in concession to the prejudices of Illinois voters. He's trying to get elected, but no farther. In Chicago, an extremely northern city in Illinois, Lincoln said, let us discard all this quibbling about this man and the other man, this race and that race being inferior. Rather, let us unite as one people throughout this wide land until we shall once more stand up and declare that all men are equal. See how he had shaped his message to the Northerners of Chicago. As for political rights and intermarriage, Lincoln believed that these were things that should be left to each individual state, the state legislatures to decide. So he allows for differences from state to state. And he said, and this is very clever, and as Judge Douglas seems to be in constant horror that some such laws are rapidly approaching state laws for equality, I propose as the best means to prevent them that the judge be kept here at home in Illinois, not sent to the United States Senate, and placed in the state legislature where he can fight these measures. There was uproarious laughter and applause from the crowd, because don't elect Douglas to the United States Senate, elect him to the state legislature where he can oppose these laws more effectively. Elect me, Abraham Lincoln. Now, in the judgment of history, Lincoln won the debates. But in the judgment of Illinois, Stephen Douglas won, and he's elected to the Senate in 1858. Lincoln swept the northern counties, those counties that were more anti-slavery. But Douglas took the middle of the state and the southern counties, and he's elected. More importantly than who won the election, the debates were carried, excuse me, in all of the newspapers of the country, or most of them anyway, and they made Abraham Lincoln a national figure. And that is why, because of the Lincoln-Douglas debates, Abraham Lincoln is eventually going to become the nominee for president of the Republican Party. No Lincoln-Douglas debates, Lincoln's not president in 1860, or not elected president in 1860. Summary. In the mid-1850s, slavery had come to dominate the public mind and political discourse. The Whig Party had fractured over the issue of slavery, and the Democrats were losing strength in the North. Soon, and this is ominous, there would be no national party with disastrous consequences for the nation. No national party that can hold the nation together. The Republican Party had arisen with the clear intent of restricting slavery to the states in which it already existed. The Dred Scott decision, of course, had challenged the very basis, the very primary platform of the Republican Party: no extension of slavery into the territories. And the decision had also increased distrust between the North and the South. Finally, in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, Illinois and the nation were brought face to face with the fact that slavery was virtually now the only issue that mattered. Both sides were becoming less and less willing to compromise and more devoted to their own region's view of the slavery issue. To argue that slavery was not the basic cause of the Civil War, as progressive historians will do throughout most of the 20th century, as Southern historians do to this day, is simply to ignore the people of this era, to ignore people of the North and to ignore people of the South and what they said and what they wrote and what they talked about. It is, in fact, to butcher the past as opposed to understanding it. It is to turn the past, that is history, into a political weapon, to weaponize the past, as opposed to finding out what happened really and writing that. Well, I thank you for your attention. If you have questions, of course, please send me an email. And I pray God's blessing on each of you. May you walk in faith and grace.